I believe civilization has often struggled with diplomacy, the AI, your opponents, essentially. Civ has seen the often controversial, for example, diplomatic victory, like in Civ 5, where basically hoover up the city-states with your extra cash, so it's essentially an economic victory, and win in the late game. Civ 6 had a similarly and at times overly gamified diplomatic system. The Congress, which was in of itself its own bureaucratic nightmare. Civilization 7 is therefore changing the diplomatic game, with a new war support, war weariness system that can be messed with, finesse, to use to your advantage. Thanks to the wide-reaching new influence yield introduced to the game, stack on top of that some streamlined trade networks and an economic victory, and you have yourself Civ 7's attempt at grand-scale diplomacy. We begin by drilling into the detail of that brand new yield, something very powerful, something I played with briefly when I was lucky enough to play Civ 7 in August of last year, and it seemed so good. This new yield or currency is of course called influence, and it's meant to help empower us to make decisions at a grand scale, no longer worried about the minutiae of diplomacy. And with Civilization 7 doing away with that deal table of civilization games from the past, we now use our influence yield to drive almost any diplomatic activity and more. Similar to gold, you accumulate influence per turn on a per turn basis, and you can spend it on a variety of things related to diplomacy. When interacting with others, whether they're AI or humans, friends you might be playing against, if you have some of those, well, it's broken down into 4 action categories. Firstly, we have endeavors, mutually beneficial actions between empires, the example they give, research collaboration. Second up, sanctions. These ones are a little bit more negative, a little slap on the wrist. You might choose to hinder their military, for example, to decrease the other player's military production output. You will, however, take a little bit of a penalty to your relationship, as you might expect. We'll talk about relationships, I'll give you some relationship advice, in fact, a little bit later in this video. Thirdly, treaties, long-lasting decisions, as described by Firaxis, that have quote-unquote utility, like open borders or improving trade relations. A little bit, perhaps, confused with the earlier endeavors, where they mentioned research collaboration. In previous Civ games, these things would kind of be the same. My take is that the endeavors that you can see on your screen right now are mutually beneficial actions, and that part is key. We've also seen that these, maybe among other things, can be limited, so one interaction endeavor per empire. The other thing that I'd note is that treaties don't necessarily give a tangible benefit. Open borders might be useful, but you and another party aren't getting straight up +6 science per turn, or whatever it may be. And I think that's the nuance, that's the difference between those two, often similar things. It is early days though, and the final and perhaps most juicy part here, the fourth type of interaction with another player, espionage, giving you a bonus, or to inflict a negative effect on another empire. There's a chance here, of course, that these actions could be revealed. Getting caught, engaging in espionage really will ultimately hurt your relationship with the other empire, also decreasing how much influence you can earn for a little bit of time. Many of the espionage examples are familiar: counter-spy, or steal a technology, a civic maybe. One of the new ones that they've showed off is military infiltration, which allows you for 3 turns to gain vision of your target's commanders. Espionage actions, of course, have a reveal chance. You might just get caught and pay those influence penalties. The rest of the actions, though, actually have a different kind of response. You can choose how you respond to most diplomatic actions. Choosing to support a proposal sees both leaders receive the benefit. It's mutually beneficial. If you choose to accept the action, this will generally give more benefit toward the leader that started the action. There is no influence cost to simply accept something. If it's put on you, you don't want to spend influence to support it, you can just let it happen, accept it at no cost. Finally, you can reject or block an action. This will cost you some influence, and it will also refund the influence of the person who initially tried to interact. I wonder if I could overwhelm an opponent with requests, or many opponents, perhaps with many allies, overwhelming them, forcing them to spend their influence on rejecting stuff rather than supporting wars, rallying troops, or all the many other, by the way, very powerful seemingly things you can do with your influence, which we'll discuss slightly later in the video. And sadly, our time to discuss these updates is very rapidly running out, though that is a good thing, for Civ 7 Day is but about 1 month away. The 11th of February is when the game releases, unless of course you pre-order, get one of those special editions, what have you, to get early access to the game on the 6th of February. According to this screenshot I took from my YouTube channel dashboard just yesterday, we've upped our game. We're now going to reach 100,000 subscribers in 2 months, not 4. However, you don't need to be a mathematician to realize with Civ 7 Day 1 month away, 100k by Civ 7 Day is still not quite achievable. But boy, we are close, we are making progress, so please yell out to your neighbor, grab your gran. Let's try and get to 100k subscribers right here by Civ 7 Day. Now, let's get back to the video, where we return to those non-AI civilization, non-human players, the independent powers, who you can befriend. They may rise and fall over time, particularly, by the way, through the ages. They may be involved with crises events. Eventually, they will transform into city-states, with you as their suzerain if you improve your relationship with them over time. Just like in previous games, the city-states have returned. However, this time around, of course, you'll spend your new influence yield not just to befriend them to unlock that suzerainship, but also to unlock some powerful diplomatic benefits where actually the impact stretches far beyond just diplomacy. This is influence really coming to life in Civ 7. When an independent power becomes a city-state, those options using your influence include things like promoting their border growth, building up their military, maybe applying pressure to your neighbors, levying their units, the part that I introduced, or of course ultimately incorporating them as a settlement to be a town, maybe a future city within your empire. You could also maybe be slightly more evil and use your influence, that diplomatic yield, to incite an independent power to raid someone else. Acquiring and or losing said influence, by the way, happens in ways you might expect. Certain buildings will provide you with influence, as well as social policies, attributes, leaders, civs, and their abilities. Maybe wonders that you build or narrative events that you engage in across the map, as well as other actions in the game world, can lead to a windfall or steady supply of influence. One example that I quite like that they give, triggering an in-game event that could lead to a windfall of influence, is settling too close to another player's capital, something I'm particularly fond of doing. This can result in a relationship penalty as well as a surplus of influence for them to spend against you. So if you're the target of that kind of aggressive expansion, you might get a whole load of influence to burn. Speaking of burning influence, if you wish to, say, conquer or raise enemy settlements, then you may face a reduction in your influence, as doing so will negatively impact how much influence you can earn per turn, adding another dimension, they say, to the strategy. And this brings us to the more emotional side of relationship building. It's those leader agendas, relationships, and ultimately, of course, war, potentially, depending on how you wish to play it. Speaking of relationships and stages, the relationships between leaders, who you'll keep throughout your entire game in Civ 7, come in 5 different stages, from helpful all the way down to hostile, with friendly, neutral, and unfriendly in the middle. And depending on the stage of your relationship, which will ultimately be impacted by things like your diplomatic actions, will influence what you can actually do. Military alliances, for example, as you might expect, can only be enacted between 2 leaders with a helpful relationship. One other big sway on your relationship will be what you like and what they don't like, and vice versa. Those leader agendas that you've seen probably teased in every single leader trailer. What do they like? What do they dislike? That will impact fundamentally how they interact with you, and the kinds of diplomatic actions that you might want to use, the kind of treaties, engagements, etc. that you might want to use. However, it's not just their nature. Endeavors, sanctions, diplomatic actions are another major way to shift your relationship forwards or backwards, as well as those diplomatic events that we talked about earlier, like settling too close to another player's territory, or perhaps engaging in the newly refined trade systems. When things don't go quite so well, it will ultimately lead to war, or maybe you're just looking for a military victory. Nonetheless, Civilization 7 newly introduced war support mechanic works in conjunction with something you may be familiar with, war weariness. War support allows either party in a war, or actually observing a war, to influence the level of war weariness, the penalty that a warring party may suffer. This causes happiness penalties for the player's settlements, as well as a combat penalty when fighting against their opponent. So, you'll face a penalty on the battlefield from war weariness, which is influenced by that overall level of support for a war, as well as a happiness penalty. And that happiness penalty, as a reminder, could influence things like, well, fundamentally, like when you'll next see a celebration, that excess happiness event, as well as the overall functioning, obviously, of a city and an empire. How much yield can it produce? Given that you can also support the war of another player, another two players, a war that you're not actually even actively fighting in, introducing this kind of Cold War, soft power element to influence. This also probably allows you to use that soft power to ultimately impact the outcome of an AI conflict, or just literally mess with people in your game. Moreover, and maybe more seriously, more importantly, of course, you can use enough extra influence to generate war support for yourself, flipping the fight into your favor. Influence, and the way that you generate it from your diplomatic actions through to the buildings that you construct, therefore has a massive impact on combat and warfare in Civ 7. I believe, probably more than any other game, at any other point in the game, particularly earlier on. As I mentioned right at the start of the video, Civilization 7 is doing away with the traditional deal table diplomacy, with their overall goal now having us focus on the big decisions. And this leads to some important changes around trade in Civilization 7. What will you be trading? Well, it'll be resources this time around exclusively, and with 3 different ways to get them. The first one is fairly straightforward. It's a growth event. When one of your settlements expands, as you have excess food, your population grows, you choose a tile with resource on it, and you will automatically receive the improvement for that tile, of course. No need for a worker. The second way is through a trade route, and you'll establish this by sending a merchant to a nearby settlement. This will set up the trade route and give a copy of each resource of that settlement produced locally there. Finally, there are city-states. There are a few city-states in each age that have unique resources that can only be obtained by working them over with influence and becoming their suzerain. The quick and dirty explanation here, therefore, is basically grow your settlement to insta-grab a resource on a tile, or send a civilian unit, a merchant, to establish a trade route, and that will give you access to those tradable resources. Speaking of resources, let's delve into those resources and merchants. There are 3 different types of primary resource that you'll be collecting and trading for its benefit in Civilization 7. We've talked about these in a separate dedicated video I released some time ago. There are Empire resources that can assist you anywhere on the map. Think iron from previous games. There are city resources that help to specialize the yield and abilities of a specific city, not a town. And finally, there are bonus resources that provide flat yield buffs to any settlement, city or town. Each of your settlements will have slots to take advantage of these resources, and you will assign those resources to the slots. Your capital will have the most, cities will have multiple, and towns will have just one. However, other factors will determine the kinds of slots, the amounts of slot, I should say, that you will have, like certain buildings, or the camel resource, which increases a city's capacity. However, eventually you'll reach your capacity for cities overall. This is when you'll need trade, if you haven't, for whatever reason, chosen to adopt trade earlier on. And simply put, a lot of the micro has been removed, streamlined even further compared to previous games. Here in Civ 7, you need to unlock the merchant unit, build a merchant, and send it to a city. This will automatically create a trade route netting you, that city or town or settlement, I should say, resources, and netting them a little bit of cash money. The route will automatically build, a land route, of course, creating a road, and a sea route likely connecting between sea-based infrastructure. And all of this good stuff comes together when we look at the economic legacy pathways, which culminate in the World Bank Victory event. One of but 4 ways to achieve ultimate victory in Civ 7. I should also note here, of course, that as part of these pathways, extra resource types become available, like the treasury resources that you need to find in distant lands during the exploration age, or the factory resources which feature in the modern age. Achieving all of this won't just give you the benefits of the resource or the railroads that you need to unlock the Railroad Tycoon legacy path in the modern age, for example, but more importantly, they will pave your way towards that World Bank economic victory. Economy and diplomacy have always been heavily related in Civilization, thinking back to that sweet diplomatic victory that I mentioned in Civilization 5 at the start of this video. And while we're getting sentimental, let's conclude with the final part of today's Developer Diary 6, where they look ahead, though they don't really give away too much about what they're going to talk about next, or what we should expect next from Civ 7, other than to say that when they wrap up this sort of broader diplomatic point that this is just the beginning. Quote, "These systems are designed to evolve, opening the door to new possibilities for expansion and refinement down the road." End quote. Of course, that could be alluding to lots of things. More information, gameplay to come, maybe free updates, how different systems in the game interlock with one another, or ultimately, paid expansion, which we have seen before when it comes to diplomacy in Civilization. Thank you very much for joining me in today's massive update to Civ 7. I'll see you next time.